I spent 40 years building a fortress of financial security for the woman I loved, never realizing she was the very threat I needed protection from. The betrayal did not announce itself with a screaming match or a slammed door, but with the quiet, clinical clicking of a bank teller's keyboard. My name is Arthur. I am 68 years old, and for 4 decades I worked as a civil engineer. My career was defined by precision, stability, and measuring risks. I oversaw the construction of bridges and commercial complexes, always ensuring the foundations were deep enough to weather any storm. I applied that same philosophy to my marriage and my finances. I worked grueling 60-hour weeks, saved aggressively, and invested conservatively so that my wife, Helen, and I could enjoy a golden retirement free from anxiety. We had been married for 35 years. For most of that time, I believed we were a unified front, walking side by side toward our shared twilight years. But the foundation of our marriage had begun to crack, and I was too blinded by my own devotion to see the structural failure unfolding right in front of me. I should have recognized the behavioral shifts of a woman preparing to rewrite her entire reality. But love has a funny way of making a fool out of a logical man. The changes in Helen started about 6 months ago. At 61, she had always been a handsome, practical woman, but suddenly, a manic energy possessed her. She overhauled her wardrobe entirely, replacing her comfortable, elegant clothes with tight, brightly colored designer dresses that cost a small fortune. A heavy, musky perfume I did not recognize began to linger in the hallways of our home. She started going to the salon twice a week, getting expensive treatments, and joined a high-end fitness club across town. More concerning than the sudden obsession with her appearance was her relationship with her smartphone. For 34 years, Helen rarely cared where her phone was. Now, it was an extension of her hand. It was always locked, the screen permanently face down on the kitchen counter. If I walked into the living room while she was texting, she would flinch, her thumb violently swiping the screen away as if she had touched a hot stove. If I asked her who she was talking to, she would brush me off, claiming it was just the girls from her tennis club complaining about their husbands. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe that my wife of over 3 decades was just going through a late-in-life renaissance. The illusion shattered on a mundane Tuesday morning. I went down to our local bank branch to handle some routine administrative work. A large certificate of deposit had just reached maturity, and I wanted to roll the funds into our primary joint high-yield savings account. This specific account was our crown jewel, the massive safety net I had poured my bonuses, my pension payouts, and our life savings into. I sat across the desk from a young, polite personal banker named Sarah. I handed her my identification and asked her to process the rollover. And while she was at it, to print me a summary statement of the high-yield savings account so I could review our total liquidity. Sarah smiled and typed away at her terminal. I watched the screen reflect in her glasses. Suddenly, the rhythmic clicking of her keys stopped. Her smile faltered. She squinted at the monitor, leaned in closer, and then nervously cleared her throat. She hit a few more keys, her brow furrowing deeply. I asked her if there was a problem with the system. Sarah looked at me with a mixture of confusion and deep pity. She turned the monitor slightly toward me. She told me she could process the rollover, but she wanted to confirm I was aware of the recent outflow activity on the savings account. I leaned forward, my engineering mind struggling to comprehend the numbers on the screen. The balance in our high-yield savings account, an account that had taken me 35 years of sweat and sacrifice to build, sat at exactly $42.16. Over $320,000 was gone. A cold, ringing sensation filled my ears. I felt the blood drain from my face, rushing down to my feet, leaving my head light and dizzy. The room seemed to tilt. I asked Sarah to print the transaction history immediately. My hands shook as I took the sheets of paper from her. My eyes scanned the lines of data. There was no error. There was no bank glitch. Over the last 4 months, massive wire transfers ranging from $20,000 to $50,000 had been systematically siphoned out of our joint account. Every single transfer had been authorized by Helen. I thanked Sarah, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. I walked out of the bank and sat in my car for a full hour. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The woman I had vowed to protect and provide for had gutted our life savings without a single word to me. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. When I finally drove home, my mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Perhaps she was being extorted. Perhaps she had fallen victim to an elaborate scam. I clung to these desperate hopes as I walked through the front door. Helen was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she arranged expensive imported flowers in a crystal vase. She wore a new silk blouse. The sight of her, so carefree and pristine while holding the knife that had just severed our future, made my stomach turn. I approached her calmly. I have always been a man who measures twice and cuts once. I did not yell. I did not wave the bank statements in her face. I set my briefcase down, poured myself a glass of water, and casually mentioned my trip to the bank. I told her I went to roll over the certificate of deposit and noticed a discrepancy in our savings account. I asked her, keeping my tone perfectly level, if she knew why the balance was practically zero. The flowers slipped from her hands, scattering across the granite countertop. Her shoulders instantly went rigid. She did not turn to face me right away. When she finally did, her eyes were wide, darting nervously around the room, avoiding direct contact with mine. She let out a high-pitched, forced laugh. She told me I was overreacting, that she had meant to tell me but the paperwork had just been finalized. She claimed she had met a brilliant new financial advisor through her fitness club. According to Helen, this man had access to an exclusive, highly lucrative private investment fund that guaranteed returns of 15 to 20% annually. She said our money was sitting in a bank doing nothing, being eaten alive by inflation, and she took the initiative to secure our future. She insisted the money was perfectly safe, completely secure, and already generating massive dividends. Every word out of her mouth felt rehearsed. Her voice lacked the natural cadence of a wife sharing good news with her husband. It sounded like a pitch. It sounded like a desperate lie formulated to buy time. Her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. I looked into the eyes of the woman I had slept next to for 35 years, and I saw a stranger. My gut twisted into a tight, agonizing knot. The instinct that had kept my construction projects from collapsing was screaming at me now. There was no secure private investment fund. There was no brilliant financial maneuver. She was lying straight to my face, and she was terrified I would see through it. I took a slow, deep breath. I knew that if I exploded now, if I demanded proof and receipts, she would burn the evidence and run. I needed to know exactly where my money went, and, more importantly, who was holding it. So, I forced my facial muscles to relax. I let out a sigh of mock relief. I smiled warmly, walked over to her, and patted her trembling hand. I told her that she had given me quite a fright, but if she was confident in this new advisor, I trusted her judgment completely. The visible wave of relief that washed over Helen's face was sickening. She smiled back, a triumphant, condescending little smile, believing she had successfully pacified her old, out-of-touch husband. She had no idea that beneath my calm exterior, a cold and calculated fury was taking root, and I was already drawing up the blueprints to tear her entire world apart. The silence in our home that night was a living, breathing thing, heavy with a secret that was about to tear my life apart. I lay awake next to the woman who had robbed me, counting the seconds until the bank opened its doors. I listened to Helen's steady breathing in the dark. How does someone sleep so soundly after burning down their own life? I had spent the evening playing the role of the relieved, trusting husband. I watched her pour a glass of wine. Her shoulders finally relaxed, completely convinced that her pathetic lie about a high-yield private fund had worked. But beneath the blankets, my fists were clenched so tightly my knuckles ached, while she dreamed of whatever fantasy she had bought with my life savings. I was mapping out a counteroffensive. I began quietly gathering a mental inventory of every financial document in the house. knowing that the real war was going to be fought on paper, far away from Helen's suspicious eyes. The moment the sun came up, I told Helen I was heading out to the hardware store to pick up some supplies for the garden. She barely looked up from her phone, offering a dismissive wave. Instead of the hardware store, I drove straight back to the bank. I did not bother with an appointment. I walked right up to Sarah, the personal banker who had delivered the devastating news the day before, and asked her for a private room. I explained to Sarah that I needed the exact routing numbers and destination details for every single wire transfer Helen had authorized over the last 4 months. Sarah looked hesitant, reminding me that it was a joint account, but I firmly reminded her that as a primary account holder, I had the absolute right to a full audit trail of my own money. Within 10 minutes, she handed me a printed ledger. The funds had not gone to Vanguard, Fidelity, or any reputable brokerage. They had been wired in massive, erratic chunks to a private limited liability company registered to a single individual. The name on the receiving account was Marcus. I left the bank with the ledger burning a hole in my pocket. I knew I was out of my depth. I was an engineer, not a detective. I needed a professional who could operate in the shadows. I drove to a nondescript office park on the edge of town and hired a licensed private investigator named Vance. I slid the bank ledger across his desk, handed him a photograph of Helen, and gave him the name of the shell company. I told him I needed to know who Marcus was, what he did for a living, and exactly what kind of relationship he had with my wife. The next 7 days were the longest of my life. I had to sit across from Helen at the dinner table, listening to her talk about her day, all while knowing she was a thief. I nodded along to her fabricated stories about the incredible returns our fake investment was generating. I forced myself to smile, to ask mundane questions, to play the absolute fool. Helen thought she was dealing with a tired, trusting old man, completely unaware that she had just awakened a meticulous architect of destruction. On the 8th day, Vance called me. We met at a diner 2 towns over, far away from anyone who might recognize me. Vance did not look happy. He sat down in the vinyl booth, ordered a black coffee, and placed a thick manila folder on the table between us. He told me he had found Marcus. Marcus was 38 years old. He was 23 years younger than my wife. He possessed no financial licenses, had no background in wealth management, and was currently drowning in over $100,000 of unsecured debt. He drove a flashy, leased sports car and rented a luxury apartment that he was chronically late paying for. He was a professional parasite, a charismatic con artist who preyed on vulnerable, wealthy people. But the financial reality was not the most devastating part of Vance's report. Vance opened the folder and spread a dozen 8x10 glossy photographs across the sticky diner table. My breath caught in my throat. There was Helen, my wife of 35 years, wearing one of her new tight designer dresses. She was sitting at an upscale rooftop restaurant, laughing uproariously, her hand resting intimately on the thigh of a younger, slickly dressed man, Marcus. The next photo showed them walking into the lobby of a high-end boutique hotel downtown. The following picture showed them kissing passionately by the valet stand. Vance's voice broke through the ringing in my ears as he explained that they were meeting twice a week. They dined at restaurants where a single meal cost $500. They booked hotel suites that ran nearly $1,000 a night. And every single extravagant bill, every drop of expensive champagne, every hour in those hotel beds was being paid for directly by the money I had saved to keep us safe in our old age. A profound, suffocating grief washed over me. I stared at the photograph of my wife kissing another man, a man young enough to be her son, and I felt 35 years of history turn to ash. I remembered the late nights I spent reviewing blueprints, drinking stale coffee, exhausting myself so I could pay off our mortgage early. I remembered nursing her through a terrible bout of pneumonia a decade ago. Terrified I might lose her, I had given her my youth, my loyalty, and the fruits of my life's labor. In return, she had handed my dignity and my life savings to a slick-haired grifter. I sat in that diner booth and let the grief wash through me. I let it break my heart. I allowed myself to mourn the death of my marriage and the woman I thought I knew. But I am an engineer. I do not wallow in the wreckage of a collapsed structure. I study the failure points, I clear the debris, and I rebuild something stronger. As I looked at Marcus's smug face in the photographs, the crushing sorrow evaporated, replaced by a cold, pristine and razor-sharp anger. The tears dried up instantly. Helen and Marcus had looked at my life's work and seen a piggy bank. They looked at me and saw a gullible, aging Mark. They believed they had committed the perfect crime against a man who would never fight back. I gathered the photos, placed them back into the manila folder, and paid Vance his fee in cash. I walked out to my car with a terrifying clarity settling over my mind. I was not going to cry anymore. I was not going to confront her and demand a divorce. A simple divorce would mean a settlement, a negotiation, a chance for her to hide what she had stolen. I was going to let them keep digging their own graves. I was going to systematically dismantle their lives, strip them of everything they valued, and legally annihilate them. The game had just begun. Walking back into a house shared with a traitor requires a special kind of discipline, the kind where every smile is a calculated lie. The hardest part of surviving an ambush is convincing your enemy that their trap worked perfectly, all while you quietly arm the explosives beneath their feet. I pulled into our driveway, turned off the engine, and took a deep breath. I had to bury the sharp, capable engineer and resurrect a version of myself that Helen wanted to see. An aging, oblivious, and slightly forgetful husband who was slowly losing his edge. I let my shoulders slump. I adjusted my posture to seem just a little more tired, a little more fragile. When I walked through the front door, I called out her name with a mild, wavering tone. Over the next few weeks, my performance became flawless. I began misplacing my reading glasses. I would ask Helen the same question twice in one evening, apologizing profusely for my slipping memory. I let the lawn overgrow just a bit and complained about my joints aching too much to fix the sprinkler system. It was humiliating work, playing the fool in my own home, but the results were instantaneous. Helen's initial paranoia vanished, replaced by a smug, patronizing confidence. She genuinely believed my mind was dulling. She felt entirely safe. Her newfound security bred an astonishing level of greed. $320,000 stolen from our savings was apparently not enough to fund Marcus's extravagant lifestyle. About a month into my act, Helen approached me in my study after dinner. She carried a sleek leather folder and poured me a glass of my favorite scotch, a rare gesture of affection that instantly put me on high alert. She sat on the edge of my desk, crossed her legs, and pitched her newest idea with breathless excitement. She told me her financial advisor was offering a limited-time opportunity to double down on our initial investment. The returns, she claimed, were consistently hitting 20%, and it was practically a sin not to capitalize on it. Then, she opened the folder and slid a thick stack of paperwork in front of me. It was an application for a massive home equity line of credit. She wanted to borrow $250,000 against the house I had spent 20 years paying off, solely to hand it over to her young lover. I looked at the documents, feeling a white-hot rage spike in my chest. She was perfectly willing to risk the roof over my head to keep a con artist entertained in luxury hotel suites. I wanted to tear the papers to shreds and throw them in her face. Instead, I let out a long, weary sigh. I fumbled in my shirt pocket, produced my reading glasses, and put them on crookedly. I squinted at the pages, tracing the lines of text with a trembling index finger. I told her that the legal jargon was giving me a terrible headache and that the numbers seemed awfully complicated for a retired man to understand late in the evening. I patted her hand and promised I would look at it over the weekend when my mind was fresher. She masked her frustration with a tight smile, kissed my forehead, and told me to take my time, assuring me she would handle all the difficult details once I signed the bottom line. While she thought I was napping in my study or struggling to complete the Sunday crossword puzzle, I was actually laying the groundwork for her absolute ruin. I reached out to a former colleague who had gone through a brutal corporate divorce, and he gave me a single name: Harrison. Harrison was a top-tier litigation attorney who specialized in high-asset recovery and fraud. He did not play the legal game to reach an amicable settlement. He played to leave nothing but scorched earth behind. I met Harrison in his austere, glass-walled office downtown. I laid out the bank statements, the private investigator's photographs, and the blank home equity application Helen had given me. Harrison listened in silence, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. When I finished, he did not offer me pity. He offered me a strategy. He brought in a brilliant forensic accountant named David, and together, we began to untangle the web Marcus had woven. Within days, David completely dismantled the illusion of Marcus the wealth manager. He traced the shell company back to its origins and uncovered a devastating pattern. Marcus was a serial fraudster. He had no real business. His entire operation consisted of targeting older, wealthy married women who felt neglected or bored. He would shower them with attention, manipulate them into believing they were brilliant investors, and drain their marital assets to fund his luxury cars, expensive clothes, and high-end living. David presented me with the files of 3 previous victims. One had been forced into personal bankruptcy. The other 2 had their marriages destroyed and lost half their net worth, all while Marcus slipped away just before the money completely ran out. Helen was not his soulmate. She was not his partner. She was merely his current mark, an open ATM that he would violently discard the moment the cash stopped flowing. The revelation brought a grim satisfaction. Helen thought she was outsmarting me to build a new life with a younger man, completely unaware she was funding her own destruction. But I could not just wait for Marcus to bleed her dry. I needed to protect what was mine before the hammer fell. Harrison and I began executing a quiet, aggressive defense. We meticulously transferred my personal pension streams and my sole ownership investment accounts into heavily fortified, irrevocable trusts that Helen could not touch, even in the event of a divorce. We altered the beneficiaries on my life insurance policies and moved my prized vintage car collection into a separate legal entity. I was systematically pulling up the drawbridge and loading the cannons, sealing myself inside an ironclad financial fortress. Every night, I returned home to my oblivious wife. I continued to complain about my fading memory and my tired eyes. I kept stalling on the home equity paperwork, offering a new, pathetic excuse every few days. I watched her text Marcus under the dinner table, her face illuminated by the screen, dreaming of the wealth she thought she was stealing. She had no idea that the walls were rapidly closing in, and the trap she thought she was setting for me had already become her cage. A hunter knows that to catch a predator, you cannot just lay a trap in the woods. You have to offer it a piece of fresh bait so irresistible that it completely ignores the scent of the steel jaws hiding in the grass. My attorney, Harrison, had made our legal reality abundantly clear. While we had proof that Helen transferred $320,000 of our joint money to Marcus, proving criminal fraud and embezzlement required more than just a paper trail of bad decisions. Helen could simply claim she made a terrible investment on behalf of our marriage, a foolish mistake rather than a malicious crime. To build an airtight, inescapable vault around them both, we needed Marcus to explicitly articulate his fraudulent guarantees out loud. And we needed Helen to actively support his lies on the record. I knew exactly how to draw him out. I had to dangle a prize so massive that his legendary greed would override whatever cautious instincts he possessed. On a quiet Thursday evening, I found Helen on the patio, sipping white wine and tapping away on her phone, undoubtedly messaging the man she was paying to love her. I walked out, carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea, and sat down opposite her. I adopted my most gentle, vulnerable expression. I told her that I had been thinking long and hard about the home equity line of credit she had proposed. I confessed that my mind was not as sharp as it used to be, and managing my separate individual retirement account, a portfolio worth exactly $500,000, was becoming overwhelming. I watched her eyes widen over the rim of her wine glass. I told her that if her financial advisor was truly generating the incredible 20% returns she claimed, It was foolish of me to leave my life savings languishing in a low-yield index fund. I wanted to liquidate my entire private portfolio and hand the $500,000 over to him. However, I added a firm, non-negotiable condition. As an old-fashioned man, I refused to hand over $500,000 without looking the man in the eye and shaking his hand over a dinner table. Helen practically choked on her wine. She coughed, hastily set the glass down, and tried to mask the predatory gleam in her eyes with a look of wifely concern. She asked if I was absolutely sure, pretending to care about my financial comfort. I nodded slowly, playing the weary patriarch ready to pass the torch. She eagerly agreed to arrange a formal dinner at our home that very weekend, promising me that Marcus was a brilliant, trustworthy professional who would put all my anxieties to rest. The following Saturday, our dining room was set with the finest china and crystal, purchased decades ago during our first years of marriage. As I dressed for dinner, I carefully secured a state-of-the-art digital recording device, disguised as an expensive, heavy fountain pen, into the breast pocket of my suit jacket. I tested the battery and the microphone twice, ensuring every word spoken in that room would be captured with crystalline clarity. When the doorbell rang, I answered it myself. There stood Marcus. He was impeccably groomed, wearing a tailored Italian suit and a heavy gold watch that I recognized instantly. He had purchased it 2 weeks prior, a transaction my forensic accountant had traced directly back to the funds stolen from my joint account. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of this parasite standing on my porch, wearing my money on his wrist, and preparing to eat the food I provided required every ounce of my engineer's discipline to tolerate. I smiled warmly, extended my hand, and welcomed him into my home as I poured him a glass of an expensive, full-bodied red. I wondered if he realized the vintage he was currently swirling in his glass was the exact same age as the prison sentence I was carefully constructing for him in the shadows. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological endurance. Marcus played the respectful, dynamic young executive to perfection. He complimented my home, praised my career as a civil engineer, and spoke passionately about the evolving global markets. Helen sat beside him, glowing with a sickening mixture of pride and affection. They exchanged brief, subtle glances, a slight smirk here, a shifting of feet under the table there. They thought they were the smartest people in the room, effortlessly fleecing a senile old man. As we moved on to dessert, I subtly tapped the pen in my pocket, ensuring the recording was active. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and adopted a tone of nervous hesitation. I told Marcus that at my age, I could not afford to take risks with my nest egg. I needed absolute certainty. I looked him dead in the eye and asked the questions Harrison had painstakingly scripted for me. I asked, in plain English, if the principal amount of my $500,000 was entirely guaranteed against any market loss. Marcus did not even blink. He flashed a brilliant, blinding smile and stated clearly and unequivocally that his proprietary private fund was backed by collateralized assets, meaning my principal was 100% guaranteed. It was a blatant, illegal lie. I pressed further. I asked what kind of annual return I could expect on my investment, noting that my current bank offered a mere 4%. Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially, and promised a guaranteed, fixed return of 25% annually, payable in quarterly dividends. He claimed he had insider access to emerging tech sectors that were completely immune to inflation. He spun a web of financial jargon that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. Then, the final piece of the trap snapped shut. I turned to my wife. I asked Helen if she was truly comfortable with this, and if her own investments with Marcus were performing exactly as he described. Helen smiled brightly, reaching out to pat my hand across the table. She looked directly at me and swore that her returns had been phenomenal. She stated, for the record, that Marcus had completely transformed her financial outlook and that I would be a fool not to trust him. In a matter of minutes, she had cemented her role not just as a victim of his charm, but as an active, knowing co-conspirator in an attempt to defraud me of my sole retirement assets. I let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy fountain pen, along with a thick stack of legal documents Harrison had prepared. I told Marcus that I had my lawyer draft a preliminary letter of intent to release the funds to his management company, pending his signature. Marcus's eyes lit up with unadulterated greed. He eagerly took the papers. What he did not know was that the document was a brilliant piece of legal misdirection. It was heavily modified with obscure clauses and contradictory stipulations that rendered it entirely useless for actually transferring a single cent of my money. However, the preamble explicitly outlined the fraudulent terms he had just verbally agreed to, framing his signature as an acknowledgement of his intent to receive the funds under those specific, illegal guarantees. Marcus did not read a single line of the fine print. He was too intoxicated by the prospect of another $500,000 payday. He uncapped his own pen and signed his name with a flourish at the bottom of the final page. He folded the document, smiled warmly, and slipped it into his breast pocket, entirely oblivious that he had just signed his own financial death warrant and handed me the executioner's axe. We finished our coffee, shook hands once more, and I watched from the doorway as he drove away in his leased luxury car. I walked back into the dining room, retrieved the fountain pen from my pocket, and pressed the small button to stop the recording. The foundation was set, the explosives were wired, and all that remained was choosing the perfect moment to press the detonator. The intoxicating scent of expensive champagne and fresh floral arrangements filled the air, but all I could smell was the impending scent of absolute ruin. Tonight was the night I would finally tear the mask off the man who stole my life, and the woman who handed it to him on a silver platter. Marcus was officially launching his grand business venture, a luxury car rental boutique he pompously named Apex Elite Autos. The entire operation was a glittering, chrome-plated monument to his ego, funded down to the last polished hubcap by the $320,000 he had siphoned from my marriage. For weeks, Helen had been buzzing around our house with the manic energy of a teenager. She was acting as his silent partner, deeply invested in the operational details and the guest list for the grand opening gala. She had purchased a stunning sapphire blue silk gown for the occasion, paid for, ironically, by my own credit card. She spent 4 hours at the salon that afternoon, determined to look like the wealthy, sophisticated matriarch of a booming new empire. She thought her blue dress would make her the undisputed queen of the evening, completely unaware that the guest list I had secretly helped my attorney compile included a few highly specialized VIPs who were certainly not there for the champagne. I put on my best tailored tuxedo, stepping seamlessly back into the role of the doting, proud, yet slightly befuddled older husband. When Helen came down the stairs, I complimented her profusely, telling her she looked 20 years younger. She accepted the praise with a dismissive, arrogant little smile, adjusting my bow tie with a patronizing pat on the cheek. We arrived at the venue just after 7 in the evening. It was a massive, sleek, glass-fronted showroom situated in the most expensive commercial district in the city. Valets were rushing back and forth, opening doors for the local elite. Inside, the sheer audacity of Marcus's spending was on full display. A dozen gleaming exotic cars were parked under brilliant theatrical spotlights. There were low-slung Lamborghinis, roaring Ferraris, and massive, opulent Bentleys. Every single one of them was leased fraudulently, using my stolen high-yield savings as the foundational collateral to secure the inventory. It was a house of cards painted in metallic gloss. The room was packed tightly with local socialites, minor local celebrities, and wealthy business owners looking to network. More importantly, scattered among the crowd were Marcus's other potential and past victims. I recognized 2 older, affluent women standing near the bar, their faces matching the files my forensic accountant, David, had shown me. They were looking at Marcus with the exact same dazed, infatuated expression that Helen wore. Marcus was working the room like a seasoned, charismatic politician. He was flashing his perfect, artificially whitened teeth, shaking hands, and kissing cheeks, completely oblivious to the fact that the heavy fountain pen sitting securely in my breast pocket was currently broadcasting a live encrypted audio feed to a black luxury sedan parked half a block away. I stood near the edge of the room, sipping sparkling water and watching the performance. Helen was absolutely in her element. She stood closely by Marcus's side, glowing with a toxic mixture of lust and pride. Whenever she introduced me to her new acquaintances, she used a tone that was polite but undeniably condescending. She presented me as Arthur, her tired, retired husband who preferred gardening to high finance. She treated me like a well-behaved, slightly dull pet she had brought along strictly for the sake of public optics. I smiled amiably, shook hands with weak grips, and played my part to absolute perfection. My heart beat with a steady, calm, and icy rhythm. The engineer in me deeply appreciated the structural integrity of the trap I had built over the last several months. It was flawless, load-bearing, and completely inescapable. As the evening progressed, the ambient music lowered, and a hush fell over the glittering crowd. Marcus stepped up to a small, elevated stage set up in the exact center of the showroom, standing directly in front of a cherry-red Ferrari. He tapped the microphone, his smile widening as all eyes turned to him. He launched into a sickeningly boastful, rehearsed speech. He talked at length about his visionary mindset, his relentless drive, and his incredible journey to self-made wealth. He painted himself as a fearless entrepreneur who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, fighting against the odds to create this unparalleled empire of luxury. He spoke of hard work, dedication, and financial brilliance, stealing the virtues of men like me to decorate his hollow, parasitic existence. Then, he raised his crystal glass high into the air. He asked the crowd to join him in a toast to his brilliant partners and his silent investors, those who had the foresight and the courage to believe in his vision when no one else would. As he said the words, silent investors, he locked eyes with Helen for a fraction of a second. It was a secret, shared moment of triumph between two thieves. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Helen beamed, genuine tears of joy and validation welling in her eyes as she raised her own glass toward the stage. I set my glass of sparkling water down on a passing waiter's tray. I checked my gold watch. It was exactly 8:30 in the evening, the precise, coordinated time Harrison and I had agreed upon. I looked toward the heavy glass double doors at the main entrance of the showroom. I caught the eye of a tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp gray suit standing just inside the foyer. He was Harrison's lead process server, a man who specialized in delivering catastrophic news to people who thought they were untouchable. I gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. I took a slow step back, distancing myself from Helen and the rest of the cheering crowd, making sure I had a clear, unobstructed view of the stage and the spectacular destruction that was about to unfold. The heavy glass doors of Apex Elite Autos were about to swing wide open. There is a specific, terrifying kind of silence that follows the detonation of a well-placed explosive, a vacuum where the oxygen used to be right before the shockwave hits. I stood at the edge of the showroom, feeling that exact vacuum form in my chest as I watched the grand glass doors swing open. As the applause for Marcus's arrogant toast began to fade into a polite murmur, I wondered if he had noticed the heavy, rumbling sound of diesel engines idling just outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, or if he was simply too blinded by his own magnificent vanity to see his doom approaching. The tall, broad-shouldered man in the sharp gray suit did not politely weave through the crowd. He marched down the center aisle of the showroom with the heavy, undeniable authority of a man backed by the full weight of the legal system. Close behind him were two uniformed police officers and my attorney, Harrison, who looked like a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. The glittering guests parted like the Red Sea, their champagne flutes pausing mid-air as the solemn procession made a direct line for the elevated stage. Marcus faltered, his artificially whitened smile slipping for a fraction of a second. He lowered his microphone, a look of profound annoyance crossing his handsome face. He probably assumed it was a noise complaint from a neighboring business. He stepped forward to intercept the man in the gray suit, puffing out his chest to project dominance. The process server did not even break stride. He slapped a massive, heavily bound stack of legal documents directly against Marcus's chest. The impact forced Marcus to grab the thick file with both hands just to keep it from hitting the floor. The server spoke in a loud, clear baritone that echoed off the polished luxury cars. He stated Marcus's full legal name and announced that he had been officially served. Before the crowd could even process the shock, a second process server broke off from the group and approached Helen. She was standing frozen by the cherry-red Ferrari, her sapphire blue gown suddenly looking foolish rather than regal. The second server handed her an identical, massive stack of paperwork, confirming her name and declaring her served. Helen looked down at the thick binder in her hands as if it were a venomous snake. Marcus, recovering from his initial shock, tried to salvage his grand opening. He let out a forced, booming laugh, picked up the microphone, and told the crowd that this was clearly a bizarre prank played by a jealous competitor. He tried to wave Harrison and the officers away, completely unaware that the trap had already snapped entirely shut around his ankles. Harrison stepped forward, his perfectly tailored suit radiating cold menace. He did not need a microphone. He possessed the commanding, booming voice of a man who destroyed lives for a living. Harrison announced to the entire room, ensuring every socialite, every business owner, and every potential victim heard him perfectly, that Marcus and Helen were named as co-defendants in a massive civil lawsuit for gross fraud, criminal embezzlement, and severe breach of fiduciary duty. A collective gasp rippled through the showroom. The clinking of glasses stopped completely. The ambient music seemed to cut out on its own. Harrison was not finished. He turned directly to Marcus and delivered the killing blow. He announced that less than 2 hours ago, an emergency civil judge had reviewed a mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence and granted an immediate, ironclad temporary restraining order. As of that exact moment, every single one of Marcus's business accounts, his personal checking accounts, his offshore shell companies, and his fraudulent limited liability corporations were completely and indefinitely frozen. The stolen money was locked in a vault he could no longer open, while Helen still stared at the cover page of her lawsuit, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the legal disaster. She was about to discover the devastating paper trail David had painstakingly assembled just for her. Absolute panic set in. Marcus dropped his microphone. It hit the polished floor with a deafening screech of feedback. He yelled at Harrison, his face turning a blotchy, ugly shade of red, demanding to know who was behind this outrage. Outside the glass windows, the visual punchline to my masterpiece arrived. A fleet of heavy-duty tow trucks pulled into the pristine parking lot, their yellow strobe lights flashing violently through the showroom glass. The repo men had arrived. Harrison had meticulously coordinated with the massive leasing conglomerate that technically owned the exotic cars. Once the judge froze the fraudulent collateral accounts, the leases defaulted instantaneously. Men in heavy boots and high-visibility vests began aggressively attaching chains and winches to the front axles of the Lamborghinis and Bentleys parked outside. The beautiful illusion of apex elite autos was being literally dragged away into the night. The guests began to scramble. No one wanted to be photographed by the police or associated with a massive financial crime scene. The two older, affluent women I had recognized earlier stared at Marcus with a mixture of absolute horror and dawning realization. They whispered frantically to each other before practically sprinting for the exit. Helen finally flipped open the heavy cover page of the lawsuit in her hands. She read the name of the sole plaintiff printed in bold, black letters. My name, Arthur. Her head snapped up. Her eyes desperately scanned the dispersing crowd until they locked onto me. I was no longer standing with slumped shoulders. I was no longer wearing the confused, vacant expression of an aging, oblivious husband. I stood perfectly straight, my hands clasped calmly behind my back, my face an impenetrable mask of cold, hard victory. The realization hit her with the physical force of a freight train. The forgotten reading glasses, the confused questions about the home equity loan, the desperate desire to invest my $500,000 retirement account, the dinner party where I played the trusting fool. It had all been a meticulous, flawless performance. She saw the absolute clarity in my eyes and knew instantly that I had known everything from the very beginning. I had watched her steal from me. I had watched her betray me. And I had quietly engineered this very moment to destroy her. The color completely drained from Helen's face. She looked like she was going to be violently ill. She took a trembling step toward me, but before she could speak, Marcus snapped. His carefully constructed persona of the suave, wealthy entrepreneur shattered into a million jagged pieces. He realized his money was gone. His cars were being repossessed, and his freedom was hanging by a thread. He turned on Helen like a starving, cornered animal. He threw his massive stack of legal documents onto the hood of the Ferrari and screamed at her, his voice cracking with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at her face, right in front of the remaining guests and the police officers. He yelled that she had promised him the money was entirely hers. He screamed that she had sworn her husband was a senile, pathetic old fool who would never notice the missing funds. He accused her of dragging him into a criminal conspiracy and swore he would throw her under the bus to save himself. Helen recoiled, bursting into hysterical tears. She reached out to Marcus, begging him to lower his voice, pleading with him that they loved each other and could fix this together. But there was no love in Marcus's eyes. There was only the feral desperation of a parasite that had just been separated from its host. He shoved her hands away forcefully, shouting obscenities at her, completely humiliating the woman who had sacrificed her 35-year marriage to buy his affection. I stood perfectly still, watching the violent, public implosion of their toxic alliance. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the beautiful, catastrophic failure of a structure built entirely on lies, knowing that my blueprints for their destruction had been executed to absolute perfection. The grand opening gala had been the explosive breach in their defenses, but the cold, sterile courtroom was destined to be the incinerator where the remains of their lives would be burned to ash. I took my seat beside Harrison at the plaintiff's table, adjusting my tie and feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. I knew Helen would try to play the sympathetic victim, clinging to the naive hope that a judge would see a confused, misguided wife rather than a calculated thief. But she had no idea what my attorney had waiting in the dark confines of his leather briefcase. The weeks following the catastrophic implosion of Apex Elite Autos had been a blur of emergency injunctions, asset freezes, and frantic legal scrambling from the defendants, culminating in a combined civil fraud and divorce trial that promised to be a bloodbath. Helen had managed to scrape together enough borrowed money to hire a desperate family law attorney. She sat 2 tables away from me, wearing a conservative, high-collared gray dress and minimal makeup. She spent the first hour of the proceedings dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, performing the role of the terribly misunderstood, heartbroken spouse. Her attorney stood before the judge and delivered a passionately hollow argument. He claimed that the $320,000 in question originated from a joint marital account. Therefore, he argued, Helen was legally entitled to 50% of those funds from the start. He tried to paint her actions not as embezzlement, but as a poorly executed, albeit well-intentioned, investment strategy meant to secure our mutual retirement. He practically begged the court to treat this as a standard, unfortunate marital dispute over finances. Harrison did not object. He did not interrupt. He let Helen's lawyer dig a deep, comfortable hole, and then he stood up to bury them both in it. Harrison approached the center of the courtroom with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. He did not yell or wave his arms. He calmly connected a small, encrypted digital audio player to the courtroom's evidence display system. He announced that he was submitting Exhibit A, a legally obtained recording from a dinner party held at my primary residence. He pressed play. The crystal-clear audio filled the silent courtroom. Every person present heard the clinking of fine crystal and the murmur of polite conversation. Then, Marcus's slick, arrogant voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. guaranteeing a fixed return of 25% annually and lying blatantly about his proprietary collateralized fund. The real devastation, however, came a moment later. Helen's own voice rang out loud and clear. She enthusiastically urged me to liquidate my completely separate $500,000 private retirement account and hand it over to her lover. She swore on the recording that she had seen phenomenal returns herself, actively participating in a scripted lie designed to strip me of the very last safety net I possessed. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for financial abuse, leaned forward over her bench. She stared down at Helen with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. Helen shrank into her chair, the tissue dropping from her trembling hands. Her attorney looked as though he wanted to crawl under the table. The judge completely shredded Helen's defense in a matter of minutes. She ruled firmly that this was not a simple disagreement over marital spending or a foolish investment error. The audio recording proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was a documented, malicious conspiracy to defraud a spouse, deliberately hide marital assets, and severely breach a fiduciary duty. By actively conspiring to steal my separate, individual accounts after already draining the joint funds, Helen had demonstrated clear, predatory intent. She was not a victim of Marcus's charm. She was his willing accomplice. Marcus tried his best to save his own skin. He took the stand and attempted to shift the entire blame to Helen, claiming she lied to him about the source of the money and told him she was an independently wealthy heiress. He sat at the defense table, furiously whispering to his bargain-rate lawyer, sweating through his cheap, off-the-rack suit, completely unaware that losing this civil suit was about to become the absolute least of his problems. Our spectacular, highly public ambush at the luxury car showroom had made the front page of the local newspaper's business section. Once the story of the frozen assets, the police presence, and the fraudulent leasing company went public, the dam broke. The two wealthy women I had recognized at the gala came forward to the authorities. Within days, David, my forensic accountant, handed his massive, meticulously organized dossier over to the state prosecutor. 3 more of Marcus's previous victims, women who had been too ashamed to report him years ago, finally found the courage to step into the light. What began as my private civil lawsuit rapidly mutated into a massive, multi-agency criminal investigation. Marcus was no longer just fighting an angry husband for money. He was fighting the state for his freedom, facing dozens of felony counts for wire fraud, grand larceny, and operating an unlicensed financial scheme. The civil trial concluded with a financial slaughter that exceeded even my own expectations. I was awarded a massive, catastrophic judgment. The judge granted me the full, immediate recovery of my stolen $320,000. On top of that, she awarded exorbitant punitive damages and ordered the defendants to pay every single dime of my legal and investigative fees. To satisfy this judgment, the court ordered the immediate, forced liquidation of every asset Marcus possessed. It was a beautiful, systematic dismantling of his fake empire. His bank accounts were drained to zero. His heavy gold watches, his designer Italian suits, his imported modern furniture, and the expensive electronics in his luxury apartment were seized by court order and auctioned off. He was completely, irrevocably bankrupted. Stripped of the armor of wealth he used to hunt his victims, Helen's fate was equally devastating. A poetic justice written entirely in financial ledgers. In a standard, amicable divorce, she would have easily walked away with half the value of our fully paid-off home, half of our remaining savings, and a generous portion of my pension. But because the judge formally found her guilty of malicious financial fraud and the intentional, bad faith dissipation of marital assets, the court applied a brutal penalty. The judge ruled that Helen's half of our remaining estate would be used entirely to pay the restitution, the legal fees, and the punitive damages she owed me. Her 50% equity in our beautiful home was instantly wiped out, transferred to my sole ownership to cover the debt. Her share of our other mutual savings was completely forfeited. The ironclad trusts Harrison and I had built around my pension and personal accounts held strong. entirely untouchable by her desperate legal maneuvering. When the final gavel fell, the illusion was dead. Helen was legally stripped to the bone. She had traded a comfortable, secure, and loving future for a temporary thrill with a parasite, and the transaction had left her utterly destitute, without a single dollar to her name. There is a profound, echoing emptiness that follows the absolute destruction of a 35-year lie. But it is an emptiness that finally feels impeccably clean. I stood in the grand foyer of the home I had just fought a brutal legal war to keep, listening to the quiet settling of the dust, knowing that my masterpiece of retaliation was complete. Yet, I also knew that the wreckage of my past had not entirely washed away, and one final, desperate ghost was bound to knock on my door before I could truly lock the gates for good. The official divorce decree arrived in my mailbox on a crisp Thursday morning, sealed in a thick manila envelope that felt as heavy as a gold brick. It was a flawless, irrefutable work of legal engineering executed by my attorney, Harrison. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping freshly brewed coffee, and read through the final stipulations with a deep, resonating sense of satisfaction. I retained absolute ownership of the house, completely unencumbered by the massive equity loan she had desperately tried to trick me into signing. My civil engineering pension was heavily shielded in ironclad, irrevocable trusts, and my recovered savings were safely anchored in entirely new, highly secure accounts that only I could access. Helen walked away with absolutely nothing. The court had methodically stripped her of her marital equity to pay the staggering punitive damages and legal fees she owed me. She left our marriage with only the tight, brightly colored designer dresses she had purchased with my stolen money. Garments that were now rapidly going out of style and serving as a bitter reminder of her incredible foolishness. Marcus, true to his parasitic nature, did what all cowards do when the blinding spotlight of the justice system finally catches them. He tried to run. Knowing that the state prosecutor was preparing a massive, multi-agency criminal indictment with decades of mandatory prison time attached to the various wire fraud and grand larceny charges, he skipped town. He abandoned his leased luxury apartment in the middle of the night, leaving behind a mountain of unpaid utility bills, furious creditors, and the shattered remnants of his fake empire. But a man accustomed to five-star hotels, fine dining, and stealing from wealthy women does not know how to survive in the gritty shadows. He lacked the discipline to disappear properly. He was arrested exactly 3 weeks later at a cheap, run-down motel 2 states over. He was caught red-handed trying to pawn one of the few heavy gold watches the court had not managed to seize during the initial asset freeze. He is currently sitting in a county holding cell, awaiting a federal trial, and slowly realizing that his silver tongue and artificially whitened smile cannot charm a federal judge or a jury of his peers. He will spend the best years of his life wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, locked in a cage where his manipulative charm is utterly worthless. Then came a rainy, miserable Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting comfortably in my study, the fireplace crackling warmly, finalizing the itinerary for a month-long trip to the Mediterranean coast, when the doorbell rang. I did not expect any packages, and I rarely entertained unannounced guests. I walked slowly to the foyer and looked through the brass peephole. It was Helen. The physical transformation was nothing short of staggering. The arrogant, vibrant woman who had strutted through the luxury car showroom in a sapphire blue gown was entirely gone. She stood on my porch soaked in the cold rain, shivering visibly. She wore a faded, oversized raincoat and sensible, cheap walking shoes that looked worn down at the heels. Her hair, once meticulously styled at expensive salons twice a week, was unkempt and plastered to her cheeks. The expensive, heavy perfume was replaced by the faint scent of damp wool and sheer desperation. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just wide enough to look her in the eye. I did not invite her out of the rain. The moment she saw my face, she burst into tears. It was not the theatrical, performative crying she had attempted in the courtroom. It was the heavy, breathless, ugly sobbing of a woman who had finally hit absolute rock bottom and realized the devastating permanence of her actions. She stood on my welcome mat and confessed the miserable reality of her new life. She told me she was living in a tiny, damp, rented room on the dangerous side of town, sharing a single bathroom with 3 strangers. She was working a grueling, minimum-wage retail job at a discount department store, spending 8 hours a day on her feet just to afford basic groceries and bus fare. She looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading, and begged for forgiveness. She pleaded for a second chance, her voice cracking as she claimed that Marcus had manipulated her, brainwashed her, and used her deep insecurities against her. She reached out a trembling hand, trying to touch my arm, whispering that she missed our comfortable life. She missed her garden, and she still loved me. She promised she would do anything to make it right, to earn back my trust, to just come back home. I looked at the hand reaching toward me. It was the exact same hand that had confidently authorized the wire transfers that drained my life savings. It was the same hand that had held a glass of expensive champagne while she toasted to my financial destruction. I did not feel a spike of anger. I did not feel a sudden wave of sadness or lingering affection. As I looked at the woman I had spent 35 years providing for, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional void was peaceful, quiet, and perfectly still. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice perfectly calm, steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. I told her that Marcus did not manipulate her into lying to my face for 4 consecutive months. He did not force her to orchestrate a plot to drain my separate, individual retirement accounts. He did not make her laugh at me behind my back while I played the oblivious, aging husband. I told her she made a conscious, calculated choice every single day she chose him over our marriage. I told her she had purchased a new life with my money, and now she simply had to live with the exact life she had bought. I gently but firmly pushed her trembling hand away from the doorframe. I wished her luck in a retail career, stepped back, and closed the heavy oak door in her face. The satisfying, heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the final, undeniable period at the end of our 35-year story. I did not look out the window to watch her walk away in the rain. She was no longer my problem to solve. I walked back to my study, picked up my glass of full-bodied red wine, and sat down in my favorite leather armchair. I looked out the large window facing the backyard, watching the rain wash the patio clean. My life is finally, entirely my own. I am traveling to the ancient cities I have always dreamed of seeing. I am spending my weekends restoring a beautiful vintage car in my garage, working with my hands the way I used to when I first became an engineer. I sleep incredibly soundly every single night, completely free from the exhausting anxiety of a hidden enemy sleeping beside me. I protected the legacy I spent 40 grueling years building, and I served a brutal, mathematically perfect form of legal justice that no one will ever be able to undo. Thank you for watching and walking this incredible journey with me to the very end. If you believe that ultimate betrayal should always be met with airtight, unapologetic consequences, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder to always protect their hard-earned legacy. Leave the word justice in the comments below so I know you stayed with me until the final door was closed. And please, hit that hype button so this video can reach more viewers who appreciate a meticulously planned, deeply satisfying payback.